Viewers have had no contact with that group. They're not even sure where they are. The miners recovering now in hospital know they're the lucky ones. These women must have wondered if they'd ever see their husbands alive. The men were stuck in the icy cold and running out of air. So 13 more families are fearing the worst. Yuri says he waited until the flood subsided. Then he made it out on his own. But the water is rising again. So all the relatives can do is wait and pray for the missing. But they know they're asking now for a miracle. And mixed with the despair, there's rising anger. A suspicion among mining families that managers took shortcuts with the safety of their loved ones. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Moscow.
Now, strong hot winds have been hampering attempts to control a series of fires that are spreading across parts of Southern California. At least 8 people have been killed. The outgoing state governor, Gray Davis, has announced a state of emergency and appealed for federal funds. Robert Nisbet reports from San Bernardino in California.
Fire engulfs whole streets, gutting buildings, leaving charcoal and misery in its wake.
Just devastating. Just very, very devastating. And I was dodging pieces of wood on fire, and the wash caught on fire because they had wood chips over there, and the heat was so intense. And they told me if I wouldn't get down, they'd come get me down. So I tried, but you can't. You just never think it's going to happen to you.
6 brush fires are burning across Southern California, the 2 most serious near San Diego and in San Bernardino, some 50 miles east of Los Angeles. This man tries to save his pets and his business.
My animal. That's what bothers me. I can replace an animal, but I can't replace my animal. They're like my kids.
But all he can do is watch. This almost apocalyptic scene here in the foothills of San Bernardino shows just how severe the fire has become. Over 400 homes have now been destroyed. Over 100,000 acres of land have been blackened. Transport too has been affected. 6 motorways have been closed. There are severe air traffic delays across Southern California, a state of emergency declared. And it's set to get worse. More strong winds and warm temperatures are forecast on Monday. Robert Nisbet, BBC News, San Bernardino.
And when Robert gave me the latest on the fires, he said the situation continues to be very serious.
There are 6 major fires burning throughout Southern California, the most serious near us in San Bernardino County, but also another just outside San Diego. And the one just outside San Diego, we understand at least 8 people have been killed in that. It's a very serious situation this evening. It's getting darker now, and it's getting a little cooler, which may give the emergency services some respite, but still a serious situation.
And in terms of, who might be responsible for this, they're still saying that it was started deliberately, are they?
Well, one of the fires, yes, in San Bernardino, they are suggesting that was started by an arsonist. There were witnesses who saw someone running away for what's believed to be the seat of the fire. But other causes are being blamed for the other fires. One near Camp Pendleton, which is a military base, is being blamed on a live munition round which was fired during practice. As for the one that's very close to me here in LA County, no one is quite sure. Obviously, that they will assess later on.
So what more can be done? Because, I mean, with those strong winds, of course, that's a real problem for the firefighters, as you've been suggesting. What more can be done in future to stop these sort of fires happening? Because they do seem to be happening fairly frequently, don't they?
Well, if you speak to some people who study these things, they'd say, well, it's just the natural order of things, that these trees grow up, and for many, many centuries, they have burnt down again, and some of these houses have been built, too close to some of these scrub areas. But yes, I'm sure they'll be looking to see whether any lessons can be learned. This year, they had an additional problem in that many of the trees had been struck by a bark beetle, which had left them effectively as tinder for the fires. The tinderbox dry, and they were absolute fuel for what happened.
Voters in the Colombian capital, Bogotá, have chosen a former union leader, Luis Eduardo Garzón, as the first leftist mayor of the city in what's being seen as a further setback for the conservative president, Álvaro Uribe. On Saturday, the president's plans to transform the country's political and economic system were not accepted in a referendum. Most of the measures proposed failed to win the required support of a quarter of the electorate. Our correspondent Jeremy McDermott, who's in Colombia's second city, Medellin, says President Uribe may turn the mayoral poll result to his advantage.
Well, I don't agree that it's bad news for President Uribe. The fact that Luis Eduardo Garzón won is no surprise. He had by far the highest profile amongst the candidates, and indeed he'd run against Álvaro Uribe in last year's presidential elections. The fact he's got the mayorship actually could be good news for the president, because there have been accusations that he's trying to establish an authoritarian regime. He can now turn around and say, well, look, free and fair elections, and someone on the other end of the political spectrum is now in the second most important elected post in the country.
But it's certainly, in terms of the referendum, that seems to have gone very much against him, doesn't it? And can he live through that, do you think?
Well, as you say, the referendum was a severe blow. The fact he couldn't draw out a quarter of the electorate to support his fairly radical plans has certainly been a setback. Where does he go from here? Well, he's now going to find himself blocked by Congress. The whole point of the referendum was to get through these changes and circumvent Congress. Now he's going to have to fight his way through, and on the controversial measures he's not going to make it. But the other crunch is, of course, money. He was going to save a large amount of money in the referendum. Now, somehow, he's got to find that money elsewhere. It's going to have to be tax hikes.
Authorities in the self-declared Republic of Somaliland say they've arrested 13 people in connection with the deaths of 2 British teachers last week. Richard and Enid Iington were shot dead last Monday at the school in Sheikh, around 200 kilometers east of the capital, Hargeisa. The president of Somaliland is reported as saying most of those arrested were security guards at the school. The Pope has ended celebrations to mark 25 years of his papacy by thanking everyone who supported him. The 83-year-old pontiff, who suffers from Parkinson's disease, spoke clearly and loudly to thousands of people in St. Peter's Square. 2 strong earthquakes have hit northwestern China, killing at least 8 people and injuring many more. The quake struck a remote area of the Gansu province within minutes of each other. The official Chinese news agency says thousands of homes have been destroyed, 90% of buildings in one village. The chief Palestinian negotiator, Saeb Erekat, has described the latest Israeli raid in the Gaza Strip as a war crime and a major breach of the Geneva Conventions. On Saturday night, Israeli troops blew up 3 12-story apartment blocks in Al-Zahra, south of Gaza City. An Israeli military official said that some of the buildings had been used to plan an attack on a nearby Israeli settlement on Friday, in which 3 soldiers were killed. I've been talking to Khaled Safuri. He's president of the Islamic Institute, a think tank in Washington, which this week is coordinating a meeting with President Bush and Muslim ambassadors at the White House to coincide with the start of Ramadan. He says President Bush is not going to put pressure on the Israelis.
It is very unlikely. I think the administration have disappointed many people that care about the peace process and the way the situation is going in the Middle East. And I do not expect in election year that the president will go on any kind of a clash with Mr. Sharon in Israel. So this is very unlikely.
So what are you hoping then to get out of this meeting?
You know, I think nothing will be done, and I think which is very dangerous for this administration election year. I think the president have to tell Sharon have to stop somewhere, because it looks like Sharon keeps getting these green lights, and he keeps taking more aggressive actions one after another. And it looks like they experiment with a new method, and then no one stops them, then they move to another harsher method. And I think that makes the job of the United States in Iraq very difficult, in Afghanistan, and frankly in the whole Arab and Muslim world, to convince the Arabs and Muslims that America is trying to be friendly. The State Department and the U.S. government is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to convince Arabs and Muslims that America needs will with Arabs and Muslims, while they give a green light to the Sharon government to continue their destruction and their policies, and they're undermining, frankly, of the president's roadmap. So I think it's very disappointing, and I think the administration should act, and act very soon.
Clearly, the terrorism, though, some might argue on both sides, has to stop. There is talk of the Prime Minister, the Palestinian Prime Minister, meeting Hamas. What hope for that and for any decent outcome from those talks?
I think it's very difficult for any Palestinian leader to try to control the elements, whether Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or other Palestinian elements, as long as they feel they're under attack. I think the Palestinian Authority should control all elements in the Palestinian side, whether radical elements, whether it's Hamas or the political groups. But the question at the end of the day, who controls Sharon? I think everyone's asking the Palestinians to control the other Palestinian groups, but no one really is asking the question, who controls Sharon? I think Arafat and whoever meets with Palestinian groups, with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, should tell them that they have to stop, because this cannot continue. The suffering of the Palestinian people has been tremendous, and this has been going on for over 3 years, but there should be someone on the other side telling the Israelis they have to stop as well.
And this is BBC News. Let me bring you up to date with the headlines. The United States has admitted it hadn't expected to face such intense attacks in Iraq after a senior official escapes a rocket attack. Hopes are fading for 13 Russian miners who've been trapped underground since Thursday in a flooded pit. Coming up later in the news, the mummy returns, the homecoming of what could be King Ramses sparks celebrations. Now more on our main news, the security situation in Iraq. I've been speaking to Marco Vicenzino, the Deputy Executive Director at the conservative think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Washington. He says the attacks on US forces are confined to certain areas.
I mean, security is not lacking. Security, the difficulties with the security has been a specific area in the country. It's the Sunni Triangle. It's from Baghdad north to Tikrit, west to Ramadi, with 90% of the attacks coming in that country, in Iraq, are limited to that area. Other parts of the country, there's relative stability in the north and the south. Who is exactly behind the attacks? That's the big question. It's generally agreed by many that it's the former regime loyalists, foreign Islamists, anti-Saddam nationalists in Iraq itself, who are just simply opposed to a foreign presence within the country. Exactly which ones make up what percentage is anyone's guess. But in due time, what's key is the intelligence, is acquiring intelligence for who's behind these attacks. The intelligence so far has gradually improved, but as Secretary of State made clear today, a greater process of Iraqization is needed. That is to increase the amount of Iraqis, expand the security forces, whether they're paramilitary, police forces, and at the same time, one has to see whether or not there has to be some cooperation with former members of the intelligence services, the Mukhabarat. Although in the short term, that might discredit the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority. At the same time, these are individuals who know the individuals in the country, primarily the criminals. There are many criminals who were released, thousands of them, by Saddam Hussein right before the invasion began, right before the U.S. troops entered Baghdad. And many of these criminal organizations are also behind these attacks. So exactly who they are, one generally suspects, but exactly who they are, one does not know. And only the people, like Secretary Powell said today, people in the neighborhood, Iraqis, can really know and ultimately defeat who's behind these attacks.
Okay, if you can just be brief on this one. The United States is actually saying that Paul Wolfowitz himself was not targeted. What's your take on that? Because he was on the 12th floor, and one of these rockets hit the 11th floor.
Yeah, at the time of this attack, I mean, the nature of this attack, quite meticulous planning is involved. Something like this can take a month or two. The fact his trip was announced quite recently, in fact, was kept very low key. But I wouldn't agree that it was targeted at him. The moment, the timing was properly opportune. It was meant to be around this time. But exactly for Paul Wolfowitz, I would say not. It was meant to discredit the Coalition Provisional Authority, to create an air of instability, to create an air of the resistance forces being able to say, we can strike wherever we want, whenever we want. That's a major challenge that remains for the Coalition Provisional Authority. Reconstruction will be slow as long as the security situation in the area around Baghdad remains as the way it is now.
Two of the main candidates for the U.S. Democratic leadership have been preparing to enter their fifth public debate. Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt attended separate church rallies to gather support for their campaigns before attending the debate in Detroit. Both candidates will be hoping to challenge the Bush administration in next year's presidential elections. 6 men linked to the suicide bombing of a hotel in the Kenyan resort of Mombasa are due to stand trial on Monday. The 6 all Kenyan Muslims are charged with the murder of 15 people. The Kenyan authorities have been under intense international pressure to find the men responsible for organizing the bombing. Social workers in Romania are calling on the government to provide free housing for the country's street children. At the age of 18, those in care have to leave government homes. If they don't have jobs or university places, they often find themselves with nowhere to go except the streets.
18, homeless, hooked on glue and pregnant for the second time. The matriarch of Bucharest's street children is trapped in a netherworld of crime and violence. It's into this world that Marinela Penu's baby will soon arrive. It's due at the end of next month, she says.
It's very difficult for 18-year-olds who go back on the streets. They're in severe danger of becoming lost causes. They become aggressive and under the influence of gangs who push them to steal and rob. We need to intervene at that age, give them an apartment and take the right measures.
Marinela's first baby was taken away by the state. She believes the glue is not harming her unborn child. Marinela was rejected by her parents and is desperate for a family life she has never known.
I want to have children, a home, to eat properly. I don't want to be on the streets. I want to get off the glue. I don't want to have this terrible existence anymore.
The plight of Bucharest's street children first came to world attention after the downfall of Ceausescu. Then about 4,000 were living rough. Now the figure is down to 1,200 or so. The Romanian government has undoubtedly taken some strides towards addressing the problem of the street children. But some social workers in the area say privately that what has been achieved is little more than cosmetic surgery. Romania's Child Protection Agency believes that accusation is unfair and offers up this halfway house as proof that something is being done. This is a place where social workers provide street children with food, shelter and hopefully a way back into society. Marian Kazatliu is a recovering heroin addict. He says for a time it was very difficult to get rid of the street habit, but he says, I have ambition, I want to get a job and don't want to go back to the bad influences. But the odds are stacked against the recovering street children and the orphans. Unless the authorities can provide sufficient free or cheap housing, there's nowhere left to go but back to the gutter. Malcolm Brabant, BBC News, Bucharest.
Now, a row over the authenticity of the pop artist Andy Warhol's work looks set to engulf the art world. The Andy Warhol Authentication Board is believed to have decreed that only works the artist was directly involved in creating can be considered originals. Warhol often left assistants to mass-produce many of his most famous pictures, and that, of course, means that collectors will be left with copies that are worth much less than they'd hoped for. Egypt is celebrating the return of a 3,000-year-old mummy believed to be that of Pharaoh Ramses I. The mummy had been on display in a museum in the United States. And earlier this month, Egypt's Council of Antiquities started campaigning for the return of key artifacts from museums around the world, including the Rosetta Stone, which is currently in the British Museum.
The return of the mummy. For Egypt's museums, a moral victory and a boost to their campaign to have other artifacts returned. School children in pharaonic costume welcome back one of the rulers of ancient Egypt. The mummy of Ramses I was stolen by grave robbers over 140 years ago. An American museum recently bought the mummy for $2 million, but was persuaded to give it back for free. There is some debate as to whether the mummy really is that of Ramses I and whether DNA tests would be effective in proving it, but there's little doubt of the symbolic importance of the return.
When I opened the case and I found the mummy in front of me, I had tears. And I had tears because I couldn't believe that this pharaoh is not finished. I have to thank Michael Carlos Museum by returning this mummy to us completely free. And this is an important message from them to every other museum, telling them that if you have a unique artifact, this unique artifact should be home.
Egypt is campaigning to have other looted items returned, at least on loan. But so far, museums in Europe are resisting. Rafael Jezeram, BBC News.
Now, let me bring you up to date with our headlines. The American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, said the U.S. did not expect the level of attacks its forces in Iraq have experienced since the end of the war. Well, that rounds up our world news. Thanks for being with us once again. I'm Alistair Yates.
Hello there. The weather scene across the British Isles is a fairly quiet one at the moment, but I think as we push on into the middle part of the week, we could be experiencing some much stormier weather, particularly to the south. A big area of low pressure bringing in some pretty heavy rain, I think, to parts of England and Wales, and also accompanied by strong winds. And that then sets us up quite an unsettled scene, I think, for the remainder of the week. But as I said, for today, it's a fairly quiet scene, cloud around to the north, brighter further south, but generally a pretty dry day on the cards almost everywhere. There's that cloud showing up here to the north in the latest satellite picture. Let's slip a little bit further south now, though, and head towards Iberia, because here we've seen plenty of cloud in recent days and lots of heavy rain. Thundery showers have rumbled their way across Spain and Portugal in the last few days, and those rainfall totals here are really starting to mount up. For Malaga on Sunday, 39 millimetres of rain in the space of 12 hours is over half the total for the whole of the month of October, and that total's just going to keep on going up as we push into the new week. More showers to come for Spain, Portugal, and also further east for the Balearics on Monday, all courtesy of this big area of low pressure here. Another low to watch out for, though, is this one across the Adriatic on Monday as well. Showers on the way across Italy, through the Balkans, and some wintry weather on the way towards the Carpathian Mountains. Making our scene at home then look pretty quiet indeed. A finger of high pressure across the southern half of the British Isles, meaning dry weather with clear skies for today. Further north, we have got a weak warm front around, not producing too much in the way of rainfall, but it will mean a good deal of cloud at times. It really isn't the front then that's posing the problems for us this morning, but rather more those clear skies. Under the clear skies, we're at risk of seeing some dense patches of fog forming, particularly across eastern Wales, the Midlands and East Anglia. It could linger on for a time too through this morning, so make for a grey start maybe before the sun punches some good holes in that cloud as we go later on into the day. Further north, though, we do still have that warm front around, so more cloud around here across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Gradually that's just going to nudge its way a little bit further south during the day, possibly seeing the cloud building up in North Wales and across northern England. But having said that, we could also see the cloud thinning out. I think the further east you are, eastern Scotland and northeast England could see some brighter spells developing. And here we could see temperatures pushing up to maybe 13 or 14 degrees Celsius. Further south, though, where the mist and fog lingers on, we're looking at 8 or 9 degrees maybe through some central areas. So that's us shaping up for Monday. Now let's see what's in store for the rest of the week. And we need to look out in the Atlantic to catch up with that. At this straight line of clouds shaping up here, that marks our weather for Tuesday. That's actually this front that's going to start to move its way south across the British Isles on Tuesday. Quite a lazy affair to start off with, the front not bringing in too much rain as it moves across Scotland and Northern Ireland. I think later on in the day on Tuesday, though, as it slips into England and Wales, it could pay up a little bit, and then we could see 1 or 2 heavy spells of rain. The southeast, though, could well escape with a dry day, and it looks like we should have some bright spells on the way here. Behind our front, some brighter weather coming in for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but some heavy showers as well, 1 or 2 which could be thundery, and it will be particularly windy here too. And certainly for Wednesday, as our front is joined by yet another front from out in the Atlantic, things start to get a lot more busy, particularly across the southern area of the British Isles. Those fronts combine and really get wound up. I think we could see some heavy rain at times across Wales and in particular southern areas of England on Wednesday, and winds touching up to gale force here as well. Elsewhere, some brighter conditions, but once again, plenty of heavy showers to come.
There are more voices to be heard. Hard-hitting, hard talk, next on BBC News 24.
24 hours a day.
Mr. Blair was advised to rest after treatment for an irregular heartbeat.
As it breaks.
A police officer has resigned following a documentary on racism.
Whenever it breaks.
The IRA said that it has carried out a new act of disarmament.
BBC News 24.
Well, I don't think I'll make an exact perfect mediator. I just think I'll be good.
Beating the bullies. One school's fight to keep the peace. From everyday life comes one life. Wednesday at 10:35 on BBC One.
Very good morning to you. This is BBC News 24. I'm Alistair Yates, and in a moment, Hard Talk, but first now 4:30, and here's the summary. Two Conservative MPs say they've begun the process of challenging Ian Duncan Smith's leadership of the party by formally calling for a motion of confidence. If 25 requests are received, a vote will be held. Earlier, Mr. Duncan Smith issued a strong defence of his position, saying he wouldn't give in to the bullying of party dissidents. A BBC poll of 126 Tory constituency chairmen found that 2/3 of respondents said they did not want a vote of confidence. The American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, has made some of his frankest comments yet about the security situation in Iraq. He said the United States had not expected its forces to face such sustained and intense attacks. Earlier, the U.S. Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz escaped injury in a rocket attack on his hotel in Baghdad. One U.S. soldier was killed in the strike and 15 people were injured, including a British official. 50,000 people have been forced to abandon their homes in Southern California as fires continue to spread across large parts of the state. Fire officers say the blazes have spread dramatically because of high winds that prevented firefighting aircraft from taking off. At least 8 people are said to have died on Sunday. The outgoing governor of California, Gray Davis, has been speaking about the fires which have ravaged his state.
Well, the worst case scenario is if the fire moves up to the mountain again in the afternoon and evening, as is its pattern, and begins to attack the Wrightwood and Gregory and Arrowhead areas. Those trees are infested with the bark beetle. They're easy pickings, if you will, and there would be a major loss of structures and major disaster. So the firefighters, local, state, and federal, are preparing for that, deploying resources to do everything we can to combat it. Obviously, we're fighting Mother Nature. That's not easy, but within our resources, we're prepared for that.
13 people have been arrested in Somaliland in connection with the death of 2 British teachers last week. Richard and Enid Iington were killed at the school where they worked in Sheikh, 500 miles north of Mogadishu. It's believed that some of the suspects were security guards at the school. The government's preparing to unveil a range of measures designed to toughen up the asylum process. The proposals include the threat to prosecute asylum seekers who arrive in Britain without travel documents unless they have what the government calls a credible explanation. The government also proposes streamlining the appeals procedure for asylum seekers whose applications have been rejected. Thousands of students have taken part in a rally in London to protest against plans to allow universities to charge top-up fees. The government wants some universities in England and Wales to be able to charge up to £3,000 a year, but the NUS says the plans will cripple students with debt and create a 2-year education system. As winter draws in, babies could be at increased risk of cot death if they're kept in rooms that are overheated. A new report by the Foundation for the Study of Infant Deaths found that the majority of parents were unaware of the correct room temperature for their baby, 16 to 20 degrees Celsius. The Foundation recommends keeping a thermometer at hand and touching the baby to make sure he or she doesn't overheat. The former royal butler Paul Burrell has told Princes Harry and William to grow up. In an interview with BBC One's Real Story, he says it's time the young princes stopped being manipulated by the system. He also says one phone call from the royals following his collapse trial last year would have ended his plans to publish the controversial memoirs. That's our news. Now on News 24, let's have some hard talk.
My guest today worked at the heart of New Labour and came to the conclusion that the British government couldn't be trusted. He was a civil servant appointed head of communications in 2 government departments and famously watched his own resignation being announced long before he'd actually decided to quit. A former BBC journalist, he now finds himself gagged under the terms of an eventual settlement with the government. Would it have been better not to settle under terms like that? Martin Sixsmith, very warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Tim.
How much are you actually prevented from saying?
Well, this gagging clause was part of the settlement I reached with the government after they'd conducted a pretty sort of unpleasant smear campaign against me.
And resigned you before you had resigned?
Yes, they announced that I'd resigned when I hadn't done. And eventually they backed down and they issued a statement saying, you know, they'd acted wrongly and they paid me a certain amount of money. But
what can't you say?
Well, what they say I can't talk about is information that I've gleaned during my time in employment with the government.
A lot of dirt?
Yes, there is a lot of dirt about, and that's you know, clearly what they don't want me to talk about, and you know, under the terms of the agreement I signed, I shan't talk about it.
How embarrassing would it be for them if you did talk about it?
I don't know whether this government gets embarrassed anymore, Tim. You know, they're pretty hard-nosed. The people I worked with were the communications people. I was a civil servant. I certainly wasn't a spin doctor. I wasn't a party-appointed apparatchik. But I did work with the special advisors, the political advisors, Alistair Campbell, Joe Moore, and so I know, you know, pretty much the sort of thing they got up to.
But they have reason to be afraid of you, hence the gagging clause.
I don't know whether they're afraid or not. I mean, the gagging clause is there because they don't want me to talk about things they don't want me to talk about. I don't know whether they're afraid or not.
How hard is that for someone who was a journalist, who was looking into trying to get the truth, looking for answers? You then sign a settlement that involves you shutting up about some pretty nasty things, perhaps.
Well, there are two.
How hard is that?
There are two aspects to that. I was a journalist. I worked for the BBC for 17 years. I was a foreign correspondent. But when I left the BBC, I stopped being a journalist and I became a civil servant. In 1997, when I went to work for the government, I was a civil servant. And I knew when I became a civil servant that I was bound by the rules of civil service, impartiality and confidentiality.
But you still have principles.
Yeah, I did. I think that's what led to the problems in the end.
And your principle as a journalist was to bring out the truth.
Well, my principles as a person, not as a journalist.
Can you leave that behind so easily?
You can't, and I think that's what sparked the confrontation at the beginning of last year. I mean, you remember that Joe Moore and Stephen Byers had been in trouble the previous year.
Joe Moore, the political advisor.
The political advisor, and Stephen Byers, the Secretary of State.
At the Department of Transport.
At the Department of Transport. And before I even went to the department, they had previous, as it were, because Joe Moore was the person who advised that September the 11th was a good day to bury bad news.
And created a huge furore.
And created a huge furore. And there were calls for her resignation. But Stephen Byers and Tony Blair stood by her. And I came in after that with a brief really to sort this out, to make sure that things were played by the rule book. And I was told on the first day by the permanent secretary, the top civil servant, that I needed to make sure that things actually were done properly, that there was no more impropriety in the department.
But you saw to the exact opposite of that, didn't you?
Yes, unfortunately.
Within a couple of days.
Yeah.
When you fell out with the government so spectacularly, how much intimidation did you suffer? How much pressure did they put on you?
It was pretty bad. Looking back now, it's you know, it's difficult even to think about it because the pressure was not just on me. It was on my family. It was on my kids. It was on people connected with me.
What kind of thing?
It was a smear campaign essentially. It was people from Downing Street ringing up journalists and giving them false stories about me.
You know that for a fact?
I know that for a fact. Yes. I've had journalists tell me that they'd been tipped off by Downing Street to pursue my financial affairs based on the fact that I owned a flat in Paris, and the implication was that they should dig around and see how I managed to afford a flat in Paris.
You say people in Downing Street. Which people in Downing Street are we talking about?
It was
here?
people in the press office who said they were ringing on behalf of Downing Street to journalists, and other stories which were planted directly by Downing Street. One journalist was told that I'd taken money for exposing what had gone on in government when I certainly hadn't. But the newspaper ran this story. And, you know, when you see things like that, slurs against you, you start to wonder about the morality of people who are doing this.
But you give the impression that there's really an army of people out there to dig up dirt about people. like you in this instance, but I mean, we'll go into other examples later in the interview.
Digging dirt had become, and I say had become because I hope it's stopped now, a bit of a speciality in government. And you remember it wasn't just me, it was the Paddington rail crash survivors, the people who said they'd been lied to by Stephen Byers. And then there was an exchange of emails from Stephen Byers' advisors looking for dirt on their personal lives.
Looking for their political affiliations, trying to make out that they were conservatives,
yeah,
just wanting to embarrass Labour.
Embarrass the government. And they clearly weren't. These were ordinary people who had no connection with politics. One, Pam Warren, was the woman who was very, very badly injured in the rail crash, and she was acting out of a personal sense of justice, you know, a search for better safety on the railway. There was no political motivation at all in what she was doing, and yet, because of the mindset of the political advisors, she immediately had to become a troublemaker, a Tory, and you know these emails went round looking for the dirt on Pam Warren.
You say the mindset of the political advisors, which was what? Which was to protect the image of the government with all means possible.
Image is the key thing in this, Tim, because a lot of the substance is lost now. I think image has become paramount for this government, and the danger is that when something goes wrong, when you're criticised, your first reaction, and the first reaction of the political advisors, of the spin doctors, is to look at what the headlines are going to be. You know, we have to avoid a bad headline. And in order to avoid that, the first reaction is to sort of lash out. And Alistair Campbell used to say, you know, if you've got a bad story against you, if you've got criticism stacking up against you, if you can't play the ball, then play the man. You know, so you go for the accuser. You don't deal with the accusations. You try and discredit the person who's making them.
So this attempt to discredit all the enemies of New Labour came from the top. Then this was the declared policy. You go after the man if you can't go after his argument.
It wasn't declared in public. It was declared within the
meetings that you attend.
Yeah, it was. And Frank Field used to say, Frank Field, you know, a man for whom I have great respect, he used to say that it's very easy for a Prime Minister to have a Mr. Heavy, to have a henchman like Alistair Campbell, because he can always blame him if things become public and you know, some of this sort of dirty dealing is revealed. It's easy for the Prime Minister to say, oh, I didn't have anything to do with it. It was Mr. Nasty who was doing it. But Frank used to say, well, you know, Mr. Nasty doesn't act without the authorisation of the man at the very top.
And as well as protecting its image, New Labour was lying. There was a lot of lying going on. You talked about a journey of deceit, a descent into deceit. A spectacular bunch of liars, by all accounts.
There was a culture in which the headline was so important, the reaction of the media was so important, that if you didn't like the facts, then you gave the version that suited you best.
Give me an example.
Well, I can give the example of my own example. The crunch I came to was when I sent an email warning Joe Moore and Stephen Byers not to repeat the sort of behaviour that had gone on September the 11th.
Which was burying bad news at a time when other news was going on. Big news was happening.
Precisely.
Funerals or September the 11th.
Precisely, yes. And on this occasion it was the funeral of Princess Margaret. And I sent the email. It was a private email. It wasn't intended for public consumption at all. It was a sort of low-key email saying, you know, don't do this. It would be silly to do this because, again, we'll have the combination of the words burying and bad news. It'd be crazy to do it. But it became public. And when it became public, the first reaction, number 10 Downing Street, was to tell the media, there is no email. And they had
a straight lie.
A straight lie. They had the email lying on their desk, and they told the media there was no email.
So when the email leaked, it was clear to the rest of the world that there were a bunch of liars.
That in that particular instance, a lie had been told.
At the root of the problem, you say, is the division between civil servants who are supposed to remain impartial and the political advisors, the political operatives. Labour has done what? Blurred the differences, tried to politicise the civil service?
Yeah, both of those. And I think it goes to the heart of what makes British politics what it is, because for a century and a half, we've had this permanent, impartial civil service, able to give fearless advice, not depending on patronage, not in fear of their jobs, able to do their job without kowtowing to the politicians because they know they're there forever, and therefore able to do a really professional job for administrations of whatever political colour they have.
But not if they're being asked to do the government's dirty work.
Precisely. And, you know, for a century and a half, that tradition of an impartial civil service has been respected. But now the culture is definitely that the civil service becomes an adjunct of the Labour Party, and it's civil service which can be used to do the political work of this government.
The Department of Transport, you say, was instructed to orchestrate a smear campaign against Ken Livingstone's Transport Commissioner Bob Kiley.
That happened before I joined the department. My predecessor, who was in the job, found out that a special advisor, a political advisor, had asked a civil servant to leak embarrassing documents about Bob Kiley because he and Ken Livingstone were pursuing a transport policy which didn't quite chime in with the one the government wanted. The civil servant, who was quite junior, said, I don't think I should do this as a civil servant. This is not, a smear campaign is not what I'm paid to do as a civil servant. Complained to her boss, and within a few weeks her boss, who stood up for her, was moved out of the department. So, you know, it's that sort of culture that if you do actually stand up for the principles of the civil service, you tend not to be praised for it, you tend to be moved on.
The lying and spinning that you allege took place in the heart of government was successful in many ways, wasn't it? It was bought by the press. Why? Because the press had too chummy a relationship with government, they were given too many treats, too many sweets. Is that what you saw from your position?
It's a pretty symbiotic relationship, because if you're a journalist, you depend for stories on the man who holds those stories, and that man is Alistair Campbell. I think you're right. I think it did work, but it worked for a few years after 1997. The first couple of years, I remember, you know, were absolutely very good. The government got its good news across. There was a great store of goodwill towards the government. I think it sort of dissipated that store of goodwill by the tactics it went on to use. But for the first couple of years, the media gave the government a very good showing. I think it's the best couple of years the government's got in terms of...
Were they too soft on the government? Were they intentionally soft on the government? I mean, you gave the example of announcements of government spending, for instance, which were made several times over on the basis that people would think each time the announcement was made that more cash was being given out. It wasn't. It was the same pot of money each time. They were just talking about it endlessly. The press bought that, didn't they? Knowingly in some cases.
They did to a certain extent. You know, there were one or two who pointed it out. But as I say, I think there was such sort of trust in the government. Tony Blair said, you know, I'm a straight kind of a guy, and people believed that. And, you know, when there were these sort of embryonic scandals, you know, the story about Formula One and the £1 million donation, which coincided with a
£1 million donation to
the Labour Party,
yeah.
Which coincided with a loosening of the restrictions on tobacco advertising for Formula One. When the Labour government said there was no connection between the £1 million and the policy decision, people tended to believe it. You know, there was a genuine trust in the good intentions of the government in those days.
And you went in believing in the genuine intentions of the government? I mean, you said this was a voyage of discovery, but you had to know from your years as a journalist that government is a pretty murky pool, isn't it?
I think one feels as a journalist, and I'm sure you know, have this sort of slight cynical edge about the way you approach politicians, is that you don't always believe them. But I think in 1997, if you think back, it's hard to remember it now, but there was that feeling of a renewal in British society. You know, after being out of power for 18 years, the Labour government was coming in promising to be whiter than white, promising to break the mould of this sort of sleazy political game playing, to actually play things straight, to be whiter than white. Well, Tim, I think everybody had the impression that the government was at least going to try to be honest and straightforward in 1997.
So looking back, wasn't it a bit naive?
Yeah, it may have been in retrospect, you know, but if you're not prepared to be naive, if you're not prepared to give people the benefit of the doubt, I don't think you're ever going to get anybody who will actually play things straight. If somebody says he's going to play it straight, then you've got to say, well, you know, okay, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and let's see how they do.
One of the tactics that you noticed, and you saw this at the Department of Social Security, was that when Labour wanted to bring in a particular move, particular measure, they would announce something far more draconian first in order to get a public outcry. They then withdraw from that, so that whatever measure they did end up bringing forward just went through on the nod.
Yeah, it seemed pretty...
You saw that happen a couple of times, didn't you?
And it seemed pretty sort of anodyne by the, you know, by comparison with the scare stories that had gone out beforehand. And that was an accepted way of doing things. And it all comes down to the way that...
It was a false story being fed to the press, wasn't it?
Yeah.
These were lies.
Yeah, pretty much so.
Dreamed up and fed to the press.
In order to prepare the ground for the real story which came out afterwards. And I actually, you know, again, call me naive, but I think that's probably wrong. And it provoked all sorts of protests from Parliament because you know that the government is bound to make its announcements in Parliament and not to the Today programme or to the Sun newspaper or to the Times newspaper. But that went out of the window. You know, as soon as a big announcement was being made, the ground was prepared by pre-announcements to journalists.
How did you feel watching this go on, being in the centre of it?
In a strange way, I admired the way they did it because they were so good at doing it and the results they got.
But it was dishonest.
It was clearly dishonest, yeah.
And you admired it?
I admired the professionalism. I admired the way they manipulated the media on one level. On the other level, it was absolutely clear that it was dishonest and it wasn't the way that a government which says it is whiter than white should be behaving.
Let's look at the former Director of Communications, Alistair Campbell, former spokesman for Tony Blair. You said there's little doubt that Campbell and his fellow spin doctors are making, or were making, government policy on the hoof. Was he really that powerful?
Yeah, I think, you know...
I mean, you went to his 8:30 meetings every weekday.
Yeah, and you know, that is a real fulcrum for the way that government policy evolves. He clearly wasn't making the long-term strategic decisions about, you know, spending £40 billion on health and education, but on day-to-day things, he was a very, very good operator. He would, you know, he'd pick up the burning issue of the day, he'd look at the overnight news coverage, he'd say, the big story today is the trade unions, we must get X minister out to talk about this, and he or she should say the following.
And the minister would dutifully trot off and do exactly what they were told.
The minister did it. You know, there was the story about...
sheep.
Yeah, I would say a lot of them were. Clearly, there are the ministers who won't be bossed around.
There were some.
There were.
Gordon Brown, for one?
Yeah, obviously. John Prescott as well. You know, but there was the story about Labour MPs having to carry a pager which was linked to Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson, and they couldn't do anything without getting the message through on the pager. And you probably remember the joke about the Labour MP who goes to the barber, and his barber's cutting his hair, and he finds a little hearing aid in his ear, so he takes the hearing aid out and puts it on the counter while he's snipping around the ear. But a minute later, the MP falls down dead, and the barber's a bit worried about this, and he picks up the hearing aid, and he hears the voice of Alistair Campbell saying, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. You know, I don't know.
The point being that they couldn't do a thing without instructions from Downing Street. Yeah. But that was true, wasn't it? To a large extent?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, clearly the joke is an exaggeration, but it's symptomatic of the sort of relationship that went on between the spin doctors and the ministers.
But it was funny that they took it. You said the funny thing is that ministers seem to believe blindly in the power of the spin doctors.
They did. I'll tell you why that is, because Labour had been out of power for 18 years, and the feeling in the party was that the government was never, ever going to get back into power. So 1997, May 1997, was a marvel for the party. It was success. And the overwhelming feeling was that that success was down to Millbank. It was down to the spin doctors who'd engineered and masterminded the Labour Party's election campaign. And that debt of gratitude to people like Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson, Joe Moore, ran very, very deep. And they felt that these people have got us into power.
They couldn't do without them.
They couldn't do without them. There was a good quote recently from John Major, you probably saw it. He said that spin is like pornography. When you get addicted to it, it's hard to get away from it. And I think, you know, this addiction to spin, this addiction to PR was very, very tough for the Labour Party to kick.
So how, as you pointed out, having been out of power for so long, the aim was never to be out again.
It clearly was, and, you know, very, very successful. But then I think, you know, and in the early days, everything looked good, but I think you reach the point where you say, is power without substance worth having? Because, you know, if you have to compromise your principles simply to stay in power, is it actually worth staying in power?
You talked a little earlier about your time in the Department of Transport and the email which you sent, basically warning political advisor to Stephen Byers not to bury news on a bad day again. Were you surprised that a tactic that had been shown up in the press and had created a disastrous furore for Labour, which they intended to ride out, but that they were using this again and again and used it in your case again.
I was not just surprised, I was horrified. And I was so taken aback by the naivety of it. You know, having learned the lesson, or at least having had the lesson given to you of September the 11th, where the whole of the media were on your back and Joe Moore had to come out and make this tearful statement and say, I'll never do it again. But Stephen Byers should think that, you know, doing it again is all right. And I think the only lesson that can be learned from that is that it is a very deep-rooted culture, and it's very hard to get away from these sort of manipulative practices that are so deeply ingrained in the spin doctor culture in the current government.
But if they hadn't turned on you in the end, how long would you have put up with this? I mean, you were happy to go along with it for a considerable period.
I'd been in the department for about 2 months, and I'd had...
Before that, with a break, you'd been in the Social Security.
Yes, and I should say that working with Alistair Darling in Social Security was one of the best periods of my working life, because he was a very, very straight minister. His political advisor was straight. There was none of this manipulative practices going on. And actually, the profile he got was pretty good, you know, so it does show that if you're a straight minister and you're prepared to play things by the book, you can actually make a success of it without spin. So it was quite a shock for me to drop into this new environment at Transport, where absolutely the opposite was the case.
How disillusioned is the civil service in general with Labour? I mean, you had plenty of colleagues in there. You had to talk about it.
I think the civil service as a whole feels that it's now under intense pressure to jettison some of the key values that have sustained the civil service for 150 years. And a lot of people are very, very upset about it. They're upset at being forced into doing political work. They're upset at being forced into doing this sort of smear campaign, this sort of propaganda, the lies.
Labour says it's changed. New guidelines, new people. Do you believe that?
I want to believe it, Tim. I want to believe it because, you know, this government has got a lot of really good things about it. I want to believe that they've kicked the habit. But they keep saying it. You know, we heard from Peter Mandelson 1.5 years ago that spin was dead. And then we heard from Alistair Campbell that there was going to be no more spin.
And then there was Iraq.
And then we had Iraq. And, you know,
two-thirds of the British public don't believe the reasons Tony Blair gave for going to war. Do you? You've worked in the heart of New Labour. Do you believe those reasons?
I find it hard to believe in the context of what went before. And if you look at the previous examples, you know, September the 11th, rail track, Bernie Ecclestone, Formula One, Black Rod, all the little things on which they've been caught out telling fibs. And I think the legacy of that is when you come to a really big thing like Iraq and like the reasons for going to war, people automatically think they've been caught out telling fibs in the past. Why should we believe them this time? And I think they've really they've cut their own throat over this one.
Martin Sixsmith, good to have you on the programme. Thanks very much indeed.
Hello there. If you live in England and Wales, your start to the day may look something like this. After clear skies overnight, patchy fog will form through this morning and it may linger on for a time too. Areas most at risk of seeing the dense patches of fog, eastern Wales, the Midlands and East Anglia, but we can't rule out seeing 1 or 2 patches elsewhere as well. And with only light winds and fairly weak sunshine at this time of year, certainly I think the fog could persist for a time this morning, but hopefully the sunshine will punch some pretty good holes in it as we head on into the second half of the day. Further north though, we've always got more cloud around for Scotland and Northern Ireland. A weak front here, not bringing too much in the way of rainfall, maybe just some patchy rain across northern and western coasts and across the higher ground, but generally keeping things pretty grey here through the day, eventually the cloud building up to across northern England and maybe into North Wales. That said though, we could just see some breaks in the cloud forming to the lee of high ground, so for parts of northeast England and eastern Scotland there could be some sunny spells on the cards this afternoon. The best of the bright weather though always to be found the further south you are. Our temperature ranges today from 8 to 14 degrees Celsius. Moving on now to Tuesday, and we need to look out to the Atlantic for Tuesday's weather. There's our warm front that's bringing the cloud into the north today. Following on behind that is a cold front for Tuesday. Not too excitable, certainly in the first part of Tuesday across Scotland and Northern Ireland. I don't think we'll see too much rain out of it then, but as it slips further south, I think it could get a little bit more active during the course of the day, so maybe 1 or 2 heavier bursts coming in across England and Wales. The southeast, though, could still escape with a bright and fine day, and we will see some brighter weather following that front to the north too, but accompanied by some hefty and thundery showers at times. For Wednesday, our first front is then joined by another one, and then I think we're going to see some very heavy rain across parts of England and Wales, and we'll also have some strong winds on the way here as well.
Hello, I'm David Eads.
And I'm Sally Bundock.
This is The World Today from BBC News. Security is tightened in Baghdad after the US Deputy Defense Secretary escapes an attack on his hotel. 13 Russian miners are still trapped underground. Rescuers keep digging. Princess Diana's former butler, Paul Burrell, keeps up the pressure on the British royal family.
And in business, Russia's financial markets set to react to the arrest of the country's richest man.
Welcome to The World Today with an hour of the latest international news, business and sport. Security is tight in Baghdad after the most high-profile attack since the start of the US-led occupation of Iraq. Up to 10 rockets were launched at the Al Rashid Hotel, where the US Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz was staying. He escaped, but one American serviceman was killed. 15 people were injured. The security situation is causing great concern for Iraqis and the coalition forces. The night curfew imposed in April, when the coalition took control, has now been lifted. The end of the curfew was aimed to coincide with the start of the holy month of Ramadan. But many people are still too afraid to go out at night.
Laith is a retired pilot. As Ramadan was starting, he and his wife made a special trip to the market to stock up. They have long days of fasting ahead and special dishes to break their fast after dark. Normally, it's a happy family time. This year is different.
Obviously, it will be something different because the occupation of American and invasion the country, and we are mostly not freely to go to the mosque and doing the rehearsal religion not freely.
Just as Ramadan started, there was an audacious attack on the Al Rashid Hotel in the heart of coalition headquarters. American Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz was inside at the time. It seemed carefully planned and executed, a high-profile reminder of the continuing violence. Security overshadows everything. This is a heavily fortified and nervous city, and many people still don't feel safe enough to go out after dark. American soldiers still patrol the streets and face daily attack. Baghdad is far from normal. The curfew's been lifted, but many here don't feel safe enough to follow Ramadan traditions and visit friends and family after dark. The end of the curfew gives Laith and his sons more freedom to pray at the local mosque, but the mood amongst worshippers is uneasy. The senior cleric says Iraqis don't trust the United States and want an end to their control of the country.
This year, Ramadan has a bitter taste for us because Iraq is in the midst of a great crisis. The country isn't in the hands of Iraqis and there's chaos everywhere. You can see the sadness in people's faces because of the occupation.
Many hoped Ramadan traditions would restore a sense of normality, but as the attacks continue, personal safety and occupation are dominating what should be a time of prayer and peace. Jill McGivering, BBC News, Baghdad.
Hopes are fading for 13 Russian coal miners who've been trapped hundreds of meters underground in a flooded pit since Thursday. Rescuers at the mine say they may not be able to reach the group until Tuesday. 33 miners have already been pulled out alive. The battle to save the men is taking place in the southern town of Novoshakhtinsk in the region of Rostov. The miners are trapped 800 meters underground with no food or water and little air. Emergency teams are still digging to free them, but relatives are now fearing the worst as icy water from an underground lake continues to gush into the mine. Well, our correspondent Sarah Rainsford has been monitoring the rescue efforts from Moscow. Sarah, another bleak night. What is the latest?
Well, I've been speaking to the rescue teams down in Novoshakhtinsk right since this started on Thursday night, and I have to say they haven't sounded as gloomy as they did this morning when I spoke to them right up till now. I was speaking to a rescue team member, and he said that they did still have hope that these 13 men were alive. They weren't going to give up hope, and they're going to keep on working until they came to some sort of resolution. But they have had no contact with the men right since the very beginning, since Thursday night. They don't know exactly where they are. They believe, or they hope at least, that they may have got to some sort of dry area, got to higher land, and be hiding out there from the floodwater. But the floodwater is beginning to rise again. It has been rising now for a day. And the main focus of the rescue operation has been trying to block, to seal the main mine shaft that was damaged, basically, when the floodwater came in. So they've been pouring scrap metal, they've been pouring concrete into this vast hole, this crater, to try and block the water. But they know that they're fighting a race against time, basically. They're saying that the flood, at the current rate, the mine could be flooded by Tuesday, and the men obviously need to be got out before then.
Now, they have, of course, managed to get some out in any case, so for all the talk being rather grim at the moment, there must still be that hope that they can save these 13.
Well, absolutely, and that's what this rescue official was saying to me today. They won't give up hope. 33 men came out on Saturday to huge scenes of elation. Obviously, their relatives extremely relieved to see them. They know this is a very dangerous job anyway, a thankless task, some might say. The mine is very underfunded. Some of the men haven't been paid for months. So they were obviously extremely relieved to see them. But it was a very difficult time then for the relatives of these 13 men who are still trapped to have to watch the happy scenes and know that their husbands, their brothers, their sons were still down there, still trapped. And the problem at the moment is that obviously as the water's rising, the oxygen levels are falling. So another part of the rescue operation is to try and pump air, fresh air into the mine. And at the same time, they're trying to dig an evacuation tunnel in from the side. But rescue teams are saying that they won't be through until Tuesday. So again, that race against time.
Very briefly, Sarah, how is it that there are these 13 left isolated on their own? Were they split up from the main group of miners?
That's right, yes. The 33 men were working in one place, the 13 were in another. It's not quite clear where exactly they were working, but yes, it was a separate group. And as I said, there's been no contact with them, no exact idea where they are.
OK, Sarah, thanks very much indeed. Well, 50,000 people have been forced to abandon their homes in Southern California as fires continue to spread across large parts of the state. At least 13 people have died there. The fires travelling at a rate of 4 kilometres an hour, stoked by strong winds and high temperatures. The outgoing state governor, Gray Davis, has announced a state of emergency, and he's appealed for federal funds to help pay for the massive emergency operation.
Near San Diego, a house surrenders to the flames. The blaze is now the largest of 10 burning in Southern California. 13 people have been killed, over 250,000 acres consumed by fire. Emergency services are overwhelmed. One of the ways the firefighters are trying to control the blaze is actually by lighting fires. It's called backburning, and that's what they're doing here behind me, to try to draw the flames towards their appliances so they can gain some kind of control. But despite their best efforts, 650 homes have been lost.
With the winds blowing 40 to 50 miles an hour, with as dry as it is, you could have 1,000 fire engines in here and you're still going to have some devastation.
All of Southern California is shrouded in smoke. Now firefighters are hoping the hot winds fanning these fires will start to die down. Robert Nisbet, BBC News, Southern California.
Now, Sally's here with the business news and a very high-profile arrest in Russia, which I suppose is going to rock the markets, is it?
We'll certainly see some reaction this Monday to the arrest that took place over the weekend. And the concern is that the owner of Russia's largest company, the oil major Yukos, could have major implications for foreign investment into Russia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky is the richest man in Russia, and he's facing charges of tax fraud and embezzlement. The business community is warning of the dire economic consequences of the move. We'll have more on that later. Also, we're going to look at a meeting of some of the world's most powerful financial players, which has kicked off in Mexico. Finance ministers and central bank governors from both rich and poor nations are gathering just west of Mexico City for the so-called Group of 20 meeting. Now, the members' economies make up about 80% of global income. Later, we'll talk about what's on the agenda and what's already been said at that gathering of very high-profile leaders. If we look now at the financial markets, this trading week on Monday, what you're seeing there on the screen is Friday's close, but there we have now the very latest on what's happening in Asia. And as you can see, so far so good. Most of the main markets in positive territory, apart from Australia. However, just to say that one of the big gainers is Honda, and that's ahead of its results, which are out tomorrow. I'll be back there with World Business Report in 20 minutes. I'll see you then. Now though, back to David.
Look forward to it. Thanks a lot, Sally. Let's get some news in brief now. New evidence acquired by the Washington Post newspaper suggests Iraq made no attempt to restart its nuclear program after the first Gulf War in 1991. The paper has interviewed weapons inspectors who believe a set of aluminium tubes produced as the main evidence of Iraq's nuclear ambitions was actually for making rockets. The trial's due to open in Kenya of 6 men linked to the suicide bombing at a hotel last year. 15 people died when a bomb exploded at the Island Paradise Hotel in Mombasa. The case has been postponed several times. The 6 defendants say they're the victims of a political witch hunt. Spanish police have seized more than a ton of cocaine from a catamaran in the port of Mazagon in the southwest of the country. The police were trying to help the vessel, which was low in the water, when they discovered 43 bundles of the drug. 3 French citizens have been arrested. You're watching The World Today from BBC News. Coming up, the latest international sport and Homeless and Hopeless, the campaign for free housing to get Romania's young people off the streets. Right, time now for a closer look at the news around the UK. 2 Conservative MPs say they've begun the process of challenging Ian Duncan-Smith's leadership of the party by formally calling for a motion of confidence. If 25 requests are received, a vote can be held. Earlier, Mr. Duncan-Smith issued a strong defence of his position, saying he wouldn't give in to the bullying of party dissidents. The British government is preparing to unveil a range of measures designed to toughen up the asylum process. The proposals include the threat to prosecute asylum seekers who arrive in Britain without travel documents unless they have what the government calls a credible explanation. The government also proposes streamlining the appeals procedure. The UK's reputation as a place to do business is being tarnished by poor transport links. That's the conclusion from the CBI, which says Britain's transport network compares badly with international competitors. In a report, it says that more than 85% of senior business executives believe that investment decisions are influenced by the quality of transport. In one of the largest surveys of its kind, nearly 500,000 NHS workers are to be asked what it's like to work in the health service. They'll be quizzed on subjects such as work-life balance, leadership and quality of service. The results will be used in future inspections and assessments of hospitals and trusts. Now, time for a quick look at the weather. Rather cloudy in the north, with drizzle in western Scotland, some sunny intervals in the east, northern England and Wales rather cloudy, mostly sunny in the south. You're watching The World Today from BBC News. A reminder now of the main international headlines. Security is tight in Baghdad after the US Deputy Defense Secretary escapes an attack on his hotel. 13 Russian miners are still trapped underground. Rescuers keep digging. And coming up in World Business Report, an economic fallout predicted after the arrest of Russia's richest man on fraud and tax charges. Princess Diana's former butler, Paul Burrell, has revealed that he would never have written his controversial book about her if he'd received just one phone call from the royal family. The latest attack from Mr. Burrell is certain to deepen the row with Buckingham Palace after Princes William and Harry accused him of a cold and overt betrayal. Mr. Burrell's book goes on sale today.
As he left his home in Cheshire on Sunday night, Paul Burrell looked tired, if not troubled. The former royal butler has had a difficult week as he begins a whirlwind tour both here and in America to promote his book about